Welcome to Tuesdays with Turbine. It's October lucky 13 and just 3 weeks to go until the U.S. elections. I'm Lee Fatzinger, CEO of the Data Fire Hose Bias Extinguishing. Where there's reputation smoke, there's likely reputation fire. Turbine Labs delivering AI-powered insights and intelligence a mere 5,280 feet above sea level. Today's episode, polling literacy in a critical election. I cannot wait to have this discussion. Our guest today is Rick Ritter, president and co-founder of RBI Strategies. Hold on a second. We're going to talk about RBI Strategies as the acronym in just a minute. It's a polling consulting firm based in Denver. He's a Washington, D.C. native. I think his parents were also from Washington, D.C. That doesn't happen very often. He's been a senior consultant for 7 presidential campaigns, as well as many congressional, gubernatorial, and local and state initiatives, as well as a whole bunch of stuff around the globe, and is also the author of the award-winning book, Looking for Votes in All the Wrong Places. Thank you so much for joining us, Rick.
Well, thank you very much for having me. This will be really fun.
This is going to be a really fun discussion, especially with just 3 weeks to go in the election. Okay, great. So, Rick, let's get started. You've probably lost count at the number of polls that you've done over the course of your career, but I want to start off talking about the world of polling in general. This is a very, very confusing and dynamic and rapidly changing tool that we use to understand who is going to hold office next. Can you just tell us a little bit about what does polling look like today? What did it look like when you started your career? Are we better off then? Are we better off now in predicting the winners of elections?
You know, when I started my career, the polling industry in the United States had slowly emerged from doing door-to-door campaigning and door-to-door research to using telephone exclusively. And even then, we, at that early stage, realized there were some problems with telephone surveys. For instance, very simple, that African Americans in the South still didn't have home telephones. So therefore, there's a great Louisiana gubernatorial campaign where the Democratic candidate, thought that he was losing, and in fact won by 10 points. They couldn't figure out why until they realized that they had totally undersampled the African American vote. Even in 1992, British pollsters were still doing door-to-door survey research. And we were one of the first firms to introduce telephone survey research to the UK. And we turned out to be far more accurate. And all of a sudden, within 6 years, people had completely switched over. But now we have the advent of 3 or 4 different types of research methodologies. Telephone, whether it be landline or cell. We have web-based survey research, which can be online, but it also is increasingly text to web, where you get a link to a web element. And now we find this year we have actual text surveys where you can respond directly on your phone to a survey. So we have a multitude of research vehicles. And interestingly, last year, I had a client call and ask, do you know how to do door-to-door surveys?
Yeah.
And I said, if only enough, I grew up in an age where I know the basics, but I said, and unfortunately, the person I would go to passed away. But it may come around.
Yeah, and I think then you have to take into consideration things like pandemic, and there are people, willing to answer those. I remember growing up in Littleton, Colorado, and around election time, if the phone rang when it was dinner time, it was either a pollster calling or the school calling saying that I'd cut class. Those
Yes.
are the only two reasons that someone would have called during dinner time. But that stream of information of I need to get somebody on the phone. By the way, I never wanted my parents to answer the phone in October of I probably was cutting class, but so they would try again the next day or the next day. And so you say, listen, if I make a certain number of dials, I'm going to get in touch with a certain number of people. That is going to create and then they'll answer the phone, and then there'll be a certain percentage of that will be willing to take the survey. And once I've done that enough times, I have in a survey of 892 likely voters, we have these results on the questions that we asked. Now we're in this multi-channel environment where this happens on the phone if possible, although cell phones are far more dominant than landline phones. And then you have texting, and then you have door-to-door surveys, and do you have to ask the same questions to get the same polling results in those different formats, or do
As
you?
as closely as possible.
Okay.
You really want to try to have exactly the same questions, because otherwise you get various biased responses
And that takes a while to work out.
to work out. And you really want to have almost precisely the same question. Obviously, you don't write for for a telephone poll, all right, I'm going to read you some questions, or I'm going to read you the names of some political individuals. Please tell me X. Well, with a online, you say, you know, the following is a list of political individuals.
So now when you're doing this, is the process more arduous now because of all these channels, or can you get the data faster because you've got multiple channels?
I think the biggest difference between when I started and now is the response rates. Just that I used to give her a list of perhaps for every